everyone. Can you hear me? Dana, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Turns out that Dana and I have been mimicking each other for a large portion of our lives. And it's a huge honor to be even compared to her at all. So thank you, Dana, for inviting me. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Let's see. Okay. So, little confession to start out my talk. I thought, I wonder how many of my audience members will have heard of ecomimicry. It's a somewhat common term, right? So I did a Google Trends search for it, and I can't even show you what I found because I found nothing. Google Trends said, we don't have any data to calculate your request. Whoops. Okay, so let's start from square one. I will tell you guys a little bit about some very basics. When we talk about mimicking living organisms and ecosystems, well, first we have to understand a little bit about how they work. And then in order to say what aspect of life are we trying to emulate, we have to talk a little bit about what we humans want, other than beer, that is. Kind of short list of human goals. So then we'll get on to the real exciting topics. What is biomimicry? What is ecomimicry? And how can ecomimicry inform agriculture, especially because that's my field, so I have the most to say about it. But also I'll say a few words about the built environment, about cities, and about industry. All right, so what does life want? Eat, survive, reproduce. Is there anything else to it? Beer, yes, I think you got the secret answer. So even a lot of my undergraduate biology students find this a tough concept to grapple with. In some ways, it's very straightforward and satisfying. In other ways, it's a little too simple. You're like, there's got to be something more to it than just reproducing, right? There certainly might be, as humans. As individual other species, it seems as though life has spent most of the past 3.8 billion years steadily reproducing over and over again. I'm sure you guys have all heard survival of the fittest, descent with modification. So Darwin's theory of evolution states that whoever survives the best and reproduces the most passes on their traits, and therefore what you see in the next generation is who survived, who reproduced, and all of life, from the earliest cells to the most complicated ecosystems, can be explained in terms of this process acting over a long period of time. So for Darwin's theory to work, you have to have limiting resources. So not everyone survives, not everyone reproduces. Some folks are, left behind, and others go ahead to form a bold new future. What are the limiting resources? Energy and materials. Materials being physical things, atoms, nutrients, things we need to build our bodies. Energy, of course, comes mostly from the sun, except for a few weird marine ecosystems, which Dana could tell you all about. Mostly from the sun, 99.99%. Thank you, sun, for all that energy. And yet, energy can still be a limiting resource. It's a little hard to capture, hard to store. Materials, nutrients in the soil and the atmosphere can also slow down the reproduction of organisms. So, as an organism, you have to be good at capturing those things and recycling them to stay alive and reproduce and eventually evolve to invent beer. So is that really all there is to it? Isn't life, or aren't ecosystems evolving towards some kind of goal? Like, don't they want to be better somehow or more interesting or... Well, not as far as we can tell. So a bunch of individuals of different species doing the best they can for themselves ultimately accomplish some pretty interesting things, as we can see by looking around us. But a lot of screw-ups, so to speak, have happened during the history of life to show that ecosystems don't always know what they're doing. Sometimes they're basically going off a cliff. Either individual species getting overpopulated, or in this example, cyanobacteria inventing photosynthesis with oxygen as a waste product nearly killed everything else on Earth with their little mistake here, because oxygen was poisonous to everyone except them, and some intrepid microorganisms managed to survive, but wow, that was a close call. So as far as we know, there's no grand plan. That might seem a little weird looking around and seeing all these beautiful, magnificent, and apparently very stable and well-organized ecosystems. Well, so what is happening here is the filling of niches. In ecology speak, a niche is a job description. It's basically what you eat, where you live, where you get your energy, who you interact with, your job description. And thinking back to our limiting resources, energy and materials, if you are not filling all the possible niches in an ecosystem, well, there's an opportunity for evolution. So over time, organisms evolve. They may evolve into new species, fill more niches, and that's why you see, now it's very hard to study how biodiversity of an ecosystem affects its function. This is a really tough topic to grapple with and experiment on. But to the extent we have data on that, it looks as though the more species you have in an ecosystem, the higher the biomass production is per area. This is a similar graph with what we call functional groups, species that do certain functions like fix nitrogen. Again, same trend, more functional groups, more biomass per area. Why is that? It's because this diverse assemblage is able to capture more of the total resources that are available. So that wasn't exactly what individual species set out to do, but it worked out that way, and most ecosystems are now diverse, stable, and productive. Okay, now about us, humans. What do humans want? It didn't used to much matter what we want because there weren't that many of us. Now there are a lot of us, about 8 billion and counting, not leveled off yet. And the effect of our reproduction on the environment, I hardly need to tell you, is pretty impressive, and I don't mean that in a good way. This is a graph of the biomass of all land mammals on Earth. So the dark gray spot in the middle is humans. The light gray areas are livestock. And the green doesn't show up too well here, but the green dots here, 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 and here, those are wild mammals. Everything else is humans or livestock. So we have transformed Earth from a system with many, many wild species into basically one giant farm. This is a local example. Tule elk used to roam the Bay Area, and now mostly their role in the ecosystem has been replaced by cattle. So this may be slightly depressing if you like wild animals and slightly joyful if you like to eat beef. You really can't have it both ways, or can you? So that's what we'll talk about. Here's our to-do list as humans. What do we want to do? And what do other species want to do? Okay, eat, survive, reproduce. I think we're all in agreement on that. Now, here's some more nuanced to-do items. So most species would quickly agree they want to use energy and materials efficiently, right? That's how they survived for 3.8 billion years. Us, sometimes we do, sometimes not. We could use a little encouragement there, perhaps. We humans have this interesting constraint of sometimes behaving ethically, not a constraint that other species tend to worry about. But then we have some kind of tricky requirements like making a profit, being comfortable. Like, we don't want to hibernate for 6 months if the weather is bad. What's up with that? We're so picky. We also want to be entertained. We're pretty impatient, right? We want results now or at latest next week. We don't want to wait 10 million years. So picky. We can all agree on not going extinct. So let's see what we can learn from other species about not going extinct. We may even have a compunction not to drive our fellow species to extinction. Again, question mark, but let's work with that. Some pessimists in the audience might be thinking, well, okay, we may not survive the next 100 years at all, so all of these creature comforts are going to be a moot point. So far, the environmental movement hasn't prospered by telling people that they can't have a cold beer and a hot shower. And so, pessimist or optimist, I'm going to argue that we have to at least start by trying to allow humans to pursue our particular human wants within our planetary boundaries. This is a highly cited paper which estimates, are we transgressing Earth's stability points for these various criteria, climate change, ozone depletion, and so on. You can see some red zones in there. The authors say, if we aren't careful, all of this is going to be read soon, so watch out. How can biomimicry and ecomimicry help us live within limits? Well, first of all, okay, what is biomimicry and ecomimicry? Biomimicry is a pretty broad term. It simply means adapting nature's designs for human benefit. And that can be almost any aspect of nature. So a great example, developed partly by scientists at UC Berkeley, is developing adhesives based on the structure of gecko feet, which can stick without glue. Humans have looked to nature for inspiration for millennia, but it's only fairly recently that biomimicry has surfaced as a term and as a scientific field. So ecomimicry, which I'm going to focus on, can be considered a subset of biomimicry working at a large scale. Biomimicry can focus on form. In this case, a propeller is mimicking the form of a shell, but the function is not the same, right? It's simply the form that's being copied. Mimicking function doesn't have to involve mimicking form. In some sense, our PV solar panels are copying the function of a leaf, even though they have a very different internal structure. And most of what I'll talk about is process at a larger scale, usually involving more components. This example looks at using trees to draw down the water table and prevent saltwater intrusion into farmland, very much like what happens in a natural forest. So the textbook on biomimicry was kind of written by a biologist named Janine Benyus, who I had the honor of working with in an internship right before I started my PhD program. With Janine Benyus and my Rocky Mountain Institute mentor, Alexis Karolidis, we looked at some applications of biomimicry for the building industry in hopes of making buildings more sustainable. One topic we investigated through literature research was structural color. Color that's inherent in the structure of a material because of the very small spaces and gaps that interfere with light wavelengths. Paint can be toxic, it can fade, it can make products harder to recycle. Wouldn't it be nice if color was just part of a material, including a building? There are lots of animals that do this successfully, so butterflies, bugs, birds, and even some plants use structural color. How hard can it be? Really hard is the answer, extremely hard. We can produce structural color in non-natural ways, like with plastic polymer films or chromium flakes. But even though this is kind of mimicking the process of refracting light, it's not copying the process of being low-tech and non-toxic, and it's not really achieving the goal we wanted. So no luck with that so far. We also looked at biomineralization, the process of assembling minerals from individual small molecules and ions found in the atmosphere or seawater. Shells can do this no problem. Can we replace concrete with something like a seashell? I mean, concrete takes a huge amount of energy to make and uses a lot of the atmospheric space for carbon dioxide. It can also break. Seashells are actually much tougher than concrete and much harder too. Same with bone and microscopic skeletons made by diatoms. Even some plants can do this. So why can't we? Well, actually, we can. We're a little better at this than we are with the structural color, but not good enough to make buildings out of it. So we can replicate not only the function, but also the nanostructure of seashells and mother of pearl. But it's very slow and very expensive, kind of like growing meat in a lab, right? We can do it, but it doesn't fulfill the profit criteria at this point. So we kind of went back to the drawing board. My internship was wrapping up, and we said, well, we learned a few things that really are not ready for prime time. That is too bad. Maybe thinking about buildings as more like ecosystems is a better way to go. So when I started my PhD program, I wasn't working on buildings anymore, but I was still very interested in the ecomimicry and biomimicry angle of things. I thought, okay, biomimicry may not always work the way you want it to. What about ecomimicry, especially at the scale of an agricultural ecosystem? I mean, after all, our agriculture basically is an ecosystem. We're just changing it a little bit, right? So how hard can it be? We just try to make it a little more natural, and then it should work better, right? Well, no, not necessarily. One of the problems is, going back to the goals we were talking about earlier, natural ecosystems don't exactly have a goal, and to the extent that they do, it's not going to be the same goal as what we have. So we want food from our farmlands and our rangelands, right? We want food, we want fiber, we want valuable materials, and we want to make a profit doing it. Natural ecosystems don't really care about any of this stuff. They are a collection of individual species working to survive, and they're not going to survive by making huge amounts of edible biomass that just falls to the ground and gets wasted, right? So, yeah, so there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of goals here. So be careful what you try to copy, right? Even if the goals were the same, we don't always know how natural ecosystems work. About the processes that drive them, and it's really hard to test this scientifically. So when I came to my qualifying exam committee chair and said, I'd like to put ecomimicry as the topic of my qualifying exam, first she said, what's that exactly? I tried to explain. She said, I don't think you can really do an experiment on that. It would be really hard. I do want you to graduate after all. So I said, okay, maybe I'll work on it after I finish my PhD. So it's not easy. I ended up working on agroforestry, which can kind of be considered a type of ecomimicry. Now you're wondering, okay, what is agroforestry then? Definition time. Agroforestry has as many definitions as there are authors, pretty much. Some would say it's growing woody and non-woody plants together on the same land. Some would say it's an old land use system that combines trees with crops and or animals. The simplest definition is just that it's trees on farms. Of course, humans have been managing and growing trees on farms forever, but agroforestry aims to make it a little more scientific and hopefully informed by ecological principles. Here are a few examples of agroforestry, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So wind breaks around a field to help the crops survive wind and dust damage. That would be an example. The trees are benefiting the crops. Alley cropping is another example, growing rows of crops in between rows of trees. I could go on and on with examples. There's multi-story home gardens. There's dehesa rangelands in the Mediterranean. Even shifting cultivation or slash and burn agriculture can be considered a type of agroforestry if it's done right. So how exactly is agroforestry ecomimicry? Why are those related concepts? Well, now trees are not necessarily a panacea. You can have the wrong tree in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in theory, trees or other perennials can really have complementary resource use to crops or animals and thereby help that agricultural ecosystem use resources more efficiently. In theory, right? Just increasing the biodiversity of the system in any way, including with trees, might increase disease and stress resistance. And the physical environment of that place may favor functional traits, again that word functional group or functional trait, that aren't commonly found in food crops, but that are found in perennial species. So maybe you saw a table like this in your science textbook at some point. How can these species interact? How can two species interact? They can compete, which is likely if you do it randomly, if you just throw species together. One can feed on the other, which can actually be a good thing in an agroforestry system. If you, for example, are growing food for animals. They can mutually benefit each other, which is really the ideal situation, but very hard to achieve. Or they can have a commensal relationship where one benefits and one is unaffected. Pretty common in agroforestry systems. For example, the trees are unaffected, but the crops get nutrients from the trees. So in theory, agroforestry can not just be a cool ecomimicry application, but can also have real benefits for real people, increasing productivity, income, achieving other functions in the landscape, and reducing production risk. But there's always a but, right? It's also more knowledge intensive, requires more labor, longer payback times, higher investment, and may not allow for mechanization. So not a clear win necessarily. This is a picture from my field work in Western Kenya about 15 years ago. And this test plot was set up on a farmer's field. This is a tree called Caliandra, and this is, or I should say was, corn. Complete crop failure. The Caliandra was supposed to nourish the corn. It just overshadowed it and killed it. Absolute disaster. I found myself wondering if the NGO that set up this experiment compensated the farmer. I don't think so, and I felt bad about it ever since. Agroforestry has many successes too, like the silvopastoral, that means forests and pasture system called Dehesa in Spain and Portugal. But note that this system wasn't created from scratch. It was kind of piggybacking on an existing forest system. So it's a little easier to work with what nature already has. Another example from Malawi, where I did my PhD research, a colleague studied 2 nitrogen-fixing trees, Sesbania, which had great effects on the soil and really helped the maize yield, and pigeonpea, which had a very mediocre effect. Farmers preferred pigeonpea. They couldn't care less about planting Sesbania. Why was that? The pigeonpea produced seeds that they could eat and sell. And that, for a practical farmer, really trumped any long-term theoretical benefit they might have gotten down the road. Again, human needs versus ecosystem needs. Now this is a pretty technical slide, and I see I have a yellow light, so I only have 5 more minutes. But in theory, when you have a multi-species agro-ecosystem, you can really reduce your risk, just like an investment portfolio. If the covariance factor is exactly -1, meaning they vary in opposite ways, your total system variance can go to 0. Great, right? So cassava does well in dry times, maize does well in wet times. Oh, sorry about that. Great, but there's always a but. So reducing risk is something all farmers want to do, but there's lots of other ways to reduce risk. I've also worked in almond orchards here in California, and frankly, most growers, when they have a problem, they just put fertilizer, pesticides, water, or all of the above until they solve the problem, because that's what they have to do to stay in business. Even the relatively more diverse system here still only has a few species, so it's not really a case of this is like a natural ecosystem. So managing risk is good in theory, doesn't always work in practice. Diverse agroecosystems can also be very labor intensive. Here we are weeding my experimental plot in Malawi, really hard work, and fertilizing corn in Malawi with this low input system, looks great on paper from a sustainability point of view. It's such hard work. We could, in the US, fertilize 1,000 acres in the time it took me and my colleagues in Malawi to fertilize 1. So ecomimicry is often a useful tool in agriculture. There are some really promising applications where it can help us understand how a system could work and have, for example, more closed nutrient cycling and more efficient use of energy. But we have to realize it sometimes conflicts with human goals. Now, to wrap up, I'm just going to say a few words about other applications of ecomimicry. Can ecomimicry inform our built environment? There have been a lot of different terms people have used to talk about this concept over the years. Industrial ecology used to be the buzzword for ecomimicry in cities, but that's fallen out of favor. We now tend to talk about green business or life cycle analysis, ecology of commerce, or the circular economy. What all these ideas have in common is the idea that our economic activities are basically a subsidiary of natural ecosystems, not the reverse. We have to live within limits and work with what we've got. So this graphic kind of shows the evolution of thinking from raw materials through to non-recyclable waste, an outdated but still very common mode of production, to a sort of semi-reusable, there's some recycling, kind of an in-between economy, to a truly circular economy. Think back to our earlier slide with the sunlight and the cycling nutrients. Ultimately, this is where we have to get if we want to survive as long as other species on Earth have survived. It's also called cradle-to-cradle thinking. Couple quick examples, one from urban design and one from industry. So Village Homes in Davis where I did my postdoc, is a really cool little community designed to be very much like a natural ecosystem, minimizing what's called gray infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, and so on, maximizing green infrastructure for natural functions like water recharge and shade provision. There's also some technology like PV panels on the house, which obviously aren't exact ecosystem mimics, but the idea is to take advantage of the natural landscape and minimize artificial inputs of energy and materials. So pretty cool, not widely replicated yet, but these ideas are really catching on. For an industrial ecology example, I wanted to talk very briefly about waste heat. So ecosystems don't like to waste stuff, right? As soon as there's a waste product, some other species will figure out how to fill that niche so it's not wasted anymore. I wish I could say the same about humans. We are pretty wasteful. One of the things we waste a lot is heat. So when we make electricity, for example, there's all that waste heat that has to be discharged. What do we do with it? Usually nothing. It pollutes a waterway and makes the water hot and maybe causes harm to the marine life. In theory, there's many things you could do with it. You could grow tomatoes, you could do aquaculture, you could power greenhouses. There's all kinds of potential uses for waste heat, but it's still very uncommon. In fact, I had a hard time finding a good example for this talk. So perhaps as we worry more about climate change and wasting energy, you'll hear a talk in 5 or 10 years' time about all the great things we're doing with waste heat. And I certainly hope so, because most other organisms would get their act together here. So ecomimicry certainly can be useful in the built environment. So far, the uses have been mostly either aesthetic, like green roofs, or kind of simplistic, like, oh, we shouldn't waste energy, which is certainly very true and important, but not a fully deep application of ecomimicry. Few words for conclusions. I believe that we could and should do quite a bit more to emulate natural processes, especially in agriculture. This is an example of a cover crop, which provides not only pollination benefits, but also enhances soil carbon and many other ecosystem services, and makes money for farmers. But sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it conflicts with our human values. This is an agroforestry system I worked with in Malawi. The maize yields are pretty good, but the labor is backbreaking, and nobody wants to spend their time doing this. Sometimes we can even improve on nature. I mean, photosynthesis is great, but it's usually only about 1% efficient. We can already have solar panels that are over 20% efficient easily, and in the lab we can do 44%. We may be kind of a little unwise in some other ways, but sometimes, just sometimes, humans can do better than nature. Final thought, as we look to nature for inspiration, we would do well to remember that we are newbies here. Almost every other species and ecosystem on Earth has been around longer than us, so we have a lot to learn about living on this planet. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I've got time for a couple questions. Oh, I see one right there in the back. Yes, sir or ma'am, I can't tell. The question was about cover crops. Are there any kinds of cover crops that are particularly helpful? That's such a great question that USDA has written an entire book on it. Different cover crops for different applications. It all depends on what you want to do. So cover crops are like a toolbox that you can use to achieve your goals of pollination, soil carbon sequestration, and so on. Great question. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am, in the front. Did you say co-ops?
Yeah, like co-ops, like one group will like grow the food, another group will clean, like in kind of like a living situation.
I think human co-ops are fantastic, kind of like mini social ecosystems. They can't necessarily solve or replace all of the really large-scale ways in which we've come to depend on natural resources. And so I think they can be microcosms of a kinder, gentler society, and they're a great place to start. Thank you. One more question? Precisely. The question was, biomimicry for building materials, why didn't it work? Is it because our starting point was not alive? And I think that's exactly correct. So when you're trying to replicate cellular processes, not having cells turns out to be a really big drawback. Tough question to answer successfully. We run into the same problem with lab-grown meat, right? Animals can do it because it's what they do. We're like, wow, this hamburger cost $50,000.
One last question right there.
Oh yes, go ahead, sir. No, I'm afraid not ecomimicry per se. So a lot of sustainable agriculture has ecomimicry aspects to it. It just usually doesn't get called that. So there are quite a lot of sustainable agriculture incentives. For example, the USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, will give you a nice subsidy if you decide to put in a windbreak or hedgerow on your farm, because it's good for your crops, good for the environment, good for the surrounding landscape. But not ecomimicry per se. It's usually more specific. Thank you. All right, thank you so much. You were a great audience.
Stick around and put us in if any more questions.
Absolutely.
Very good. So why don't we take a quick 7-minute break? Please grab a drink, grab a grilled cheese. We'll be back at 7. We'll talk about the railroads.
It always helps when you turn it on. That's a trick. Make sure it's turned on. Okay. Yeah, well, we're here to share some minutia in history that a lot of people are not familiar with. You might be familiar with that famous picture of the golden spike when the East met the West and the railroads connected, supposedly creating the Transcontinental Railroad. What we're going to show you is that not only did that railroad not actually connect the Atlantic and the Pacific for another 3 years, but it also deprived San Francisco of being the terminus of that actual railroad, which instead went to the East Bay. Literally, quite literally. And yeah, so just as a comparison here, we have the Grand Central Station from New York City. Quite the impressive rail palace compared with San Francisco's version, which looks roughly like a bus depot, because in fact that's what it is, isn't it? Yeah, and then let me see if I know how this thing works. Oh yeah, I do. Okay, good. I got it right. So, yeah. So there was, you know, just like we were talking about how the gentleman went across the country. Somebody had this idea that they were going to come from New York and go directly to San Francisco on a transcontinental train. Not quite that simple.
So I mean, what happens here is there's a young lady. She's on the train. She's come from New York, big beautiful train station. She doesn't know anything. She can't wait to get to the big beautiful train station in San Francisco. And she's on the Amtrak. And at Berkeley, they wake her up and tell her she has to get off at the next stop and ride the bus to San Francisco.
That's how it works.
And that's exactly what you got to do. And this poor lady has to ride the bus for two reasons. The first reason is that a group of guys in San Francisco in December of 1861 got Theodore Judah really, really mad. And he left. And there was another guy, Charlie Goffman, right in the middle of Niles Canyon. There's a curve in the middle of Niles Canyon. And the train, we're going to show you, the train stopped there, and Charlie McLaughlin, who ran the old Western Pacific Railroad, thought he was going to get his money. And when he found out he wasn't going to get his money, he walked out of Niles Canyon, left everybody hanging, and the Western Pacific Railroad, the first one, stopped running right at Dead Cow Curve. And
Well-
you want to go?
I'm just saying, don't get too far ahead of yourself just yet, because we got all these slides coming up. And
Laugh at this, but Eric needs to rein me in.
I try to be diplomatic. The point is, the point is, the lady wasn't the first one to have that experience, right? It was this group from Boston.
Those guys.
Tell them about the group from Boston.
These guys here. Now, what happens here is those are beautiful Pullman cars. And Pullman wants to show off his cars. And in 1870, just less than a year after the first Transcontinental Railroad arrived in what he called was San Francisco, he takes his train, invites every nabob from Boston to board it, the whole board of directors, the mayor, and everybody's on it, and they go down to the Atlantic Ocean, and they scoop up some Atlantic Ocean water, and they can't wait to get so they can pour the Atlantic Ocean water into the Pacific Ocean, and the train pulls into Oakland.
Oops.
And not only that, but the train pulls into a single little pier in Oakland, and they get told, we're sorry, you can't pour your water into the Pacific Ocean until you ride the ferry over to San Francisco.
And then
Then we're not there yet.
you got to take, what, a stagecoach across a peninsula?
Stagecoaches over to the Pacific Ocean, then you can go. See? And this all goes back to the fact that all this shenanigans that went on through 1866 and 1867, and especially in 1868, the trains ran into Alameda, and the trains ran into Oakland, and these guys found out that
The hard way.
I got to take a stagecoach before I can get to before my water in. Despite the fact they were lied to. Right? They were told by the Union Pacific Railroad that this new railroad went from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean.
Yep, it was in print. It was in the advertisements and everything.
The big ad.
Yeah,
It went from New York to San Francisco.
not exactly.
Not exactly.
But we'll get to that. So wait, why doesn't it go to San Francisco, Dennis? They had a railroad.
Right.
They had a railroad connecting to San Jose.
So here we go here. First of all, look at the name of the railroad. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. That's a nice name, except it went from San Francisco to San Jose. This is how it starts, all right? And not only that, but you already have stagecoaches running here. You already have guys driving freight down these roads, and they don't want any railroads because they'll lose money. So we don't want these pesky railroads here. So they try. 1849, they try to run. Now, I love it. Pacific, San Francisco, Atlantic, San Jose. This is how this starts.
They almost got there. And they
By the way, it's going to run through Macy'sville.
the important Mises.
Right, which is now part of Redwood City.
Anyway, back in the day. But over here in the East Bay, we had some other early railroads going on. So this timeline kind of shows you how these early railroads unfolded. Our San Francisco and San Jose is here. The San Francisco and Oakland, which connected, what was it?
What happens is two things happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Two things happen. They need these short line railroads. They want to get you out of the port. They want to get you from downtown Oakland out to the port. They want to get you from downtown Oakland over to what's now 14th Avenue, where the ferries are. And so they build a San Francisco, what they call the San Francisco and Oakland Railroad. And this is built by a guy I call Uncle Rocky. What happens is we're going to meet a guy in a few minutes who spent some time in jail. While he was in jail, he did what everybody does in jail. He studied for his bar exam. He came out, he passed his bar exam, and then he got all his crooked friends to help him build a railroad. And they did that in Alameda. All right?
San Francisco and Alameda.
Yeah, so there's the Alameda, San Francisco and Alameda Railroad, 1863. San Francisco and Oakland, 1861. Meanwhile, Mr. Cohen, the guy who was in jail studying for the bar exam and started the Alameda Railroad, he watches his uncle run out of money, and then says, Uncle Robin, I have an idea. Why don't I just take it? And Uncle Robin, there's nothing he can do about it. So Cohen owns the Alameda Railroad, he owns the Oakland Railroad, and look what's in the middle.
The Western Pacific. The Western Pacific. And so we're going to get to that next, right? Yeah.
So what happens here is there's all these guys at this meeting in 1861, and here's this Theodore Judah, and some of these guys want to do a railroad and some of them don't, but there's not enough money. So Theodore Judah walks out of the meeting, goes home to the hotel to his wife Ann, and says, we're going back to Sacramento. Judah had already built a railroad in Sacramento. And everybody knew him up there, and he sat down and he got people, guys who became the Big Four, to invest the money, and San Francisco is left out in the cold. Except there's a few guys who have a brilliant idea. The brilliant idea is we're going to build a railroad down to San Jose, then we're going to build a railroad up to Sacramento, and we're going to be ready when the Transcontinental Railroad shows up in 1869. However, it
Didn't quite work out that way. Yeah.
just
So,
didn't quite work out that way. So
and this was the guy who did the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad, the first one.
So what happens is we get a couple of guys, Houston and to go out and do them stagecoach lines. And they didn't want the Tusky Railroad at first. And then they thought, you know what, maybe it's not a bad idea. So they get their money prints. Peter Dunning had a lot of money. He was foundry in San Francisco, lots of money. He built locomotives. So he had an interest in all this, right? So they gave Peter Dunning and a few of their friends to invest in the idea of building the railroad from San Francisco down to Santa Fe, and they finish it. And they're all done. And they should be happy. But they're not happy because they're greedy. And they're greedy, and they go, we got an idea now, we're going to build that railroad up to Sacramento, and here's the problem. When you're getting the money from the government, you have to build the first 20 miles out of your own money. Then you get the money, right?
Yep.
Then you get the money.
Right. So this is another map of the San Francisco and San Jose.
I got this thing I can show you right here. Here goes. There we go. Here's the station here. Here goes the line. There's the railroad line from San Francisco down all the way down. The San Jose end of this isn't on this map, but it goes in and it serves all these communities here. All of them that the stagecoaches were serving. The stagecoach people are back. And it serves all these communities that the freight haulers were serving. The freight haulers are back. So, this isn't a very good idea for some people, but here is the very first railroad that ran in the Bay Area. They're called short lines. There's 3 short lines that play an important role there. There's one.
So this is the first line in Oakland, the San Francisco and Oakland. This is Uncle Rodman's line.
See that? There's Uncle Rodman right there. See? There's Roddy right there, and Uncle Rodman says, I'm going to build a wharf out on the end of what is now 7th Street in Oakland. And I'm going to build a road out there, not just for freight to go out there. And he never built the road, and everybody laughed at him. And they called the wharf
Gibbon's Folly.
Everybody laughed at Uncle Rodman, but Uncle Rodman had a secret. He's from Wilmington, Delaware. He has friends in the dynamite company with the DuPont family, and he gets their money, and he gets his friends together, and he builds a railroad. Instead of having a freight road, he has a railroad. The railroad connects downtown Oakland, right down the street, here's 7th and Broadway, out to what is now Port Oakland. And then later on, he says, well, I'm going to build a railroad over to 14th Avenue, which this little town of San Antonio is, and that's when he ran out of money. But this is Uncle Rodman's his folly, the wharf, and then the railroad that he built to answer the people who laughed at him because he built the folly.
Yeah. Back in the day, whenever you wanted to make fun of somebody, you just told them they had a folly for an idea, right? Yeah, you and your follies. Anyway. So here we are in the Contra Costa, as the entire East Bay used to be known before they subdivided Alameda County off. But this little map gives you an idea of these short lines. Uncle Rodman's line is there on the top, as Dennis is indicating. And the lower line there is A. Cohen's San Francisco and Alameda, which would connect down to as far as Hayward. And that proved to be the deciding factor in where the Transcontinental Railroad would go, is that this railroad was the furthest, I guess, west.
And then they'll also hook these two together.
Later on.
Yeah, later on.
Right.
These two together.
And what do we have here?
So,
Yeah.
this is a little bit about Cohen. Yeah, we already talked about it. Uncle Roddy and his young little nephew, A. Cohen, who just told his uncle politics.
Yep. Railroad barons of the East Bay.
Right.
And here we are stuck in Niles Canyon at the infamous Dead Cow Curve. And apparently the place got its name because the poor cows, for whatever reason, slipped off the hill at this point, were found dead on the tracks. And so it became known, obviously, as dead cow curve.
I mean, you go down there today, be careful, you gotta sneak in. You go down there and you can walk on dead cow's curve.
Dennis just did it the other day.
I just did it the other day.
Don't,
I know where no cows.
we don't recommend you try this at home.
No dead cows. They have, they open Niles Canyon to just the pedestrians. And so no cars were allowed. And I got up to the road where I could get in and sneak around. The cop car sitting there. So I pretend like I'm taking a picture of the bridges. There's a little Farwell bridge out there. And then I kept backing up to see if he'd say anything. And then I backed up around the corner. He couldn't see me anymore. And then I started walking real fast and nobody stopped. So I got to go walk around dead cow curve. And this is where these guys are. They're at dead cow. I mean, look at them all. They're going to send a government inspector out to see whether they reached the 20 miles. Now, look at a government inspector. Nothing's changed.
Wait, tell them about, did we talk about the 20 miles?
Look at all. Yeah, so here's what happens. They got to have the 20 miles built out of their own pocket. You got to pay the first 20 miles.
Yeah.
And this guy, this Charlie McLaughlin guy, who took over the railroad, is lying to his teeth. He's telling the government he's got 20 miles built, and he doesn't.
Yes.
They say you have until June of 1866 to finish your 20 miles, and he doesn't. You have until October of 1866 to finish it, and he doesn't, but he lies. And they bring the government inspectors in, and the government inspectors go, this isn't 20 miles. What's going on here? First of all. Second of all, all the land where Niles Canyon is used to be in Spanish hands. They were land grabs. So the government said, you know what? We're going to give you your money. This is on October 2nd, 1866. We're going to give you your money. But you can't have the money till January. And Charlie McLaughlin wasn't happy. And he walked out of the middle of this canyon. He left 9 locomotives screwed between Milpitas and here. He left railroad ties. He left railroad steel. He left the hammers. But more importantly, he left all the men. And one of the men he left was really mad.
He owed him some money, right?
He owed him money. See, this guy,
Is this-
Mr. McLaughlin, Charlie was going to get $362,000. That's a lot of money. And there's a guy named Jacob Cox. And Jacob was going to get $50,000. And they said, Mr. Cox, Charlie says to Mr. Cox, you're not getting it done. Right? You're not getting it done. And what happens is 17 years pass. And Mr. Cox tries to get the money from Charlie. And 17 years go by, and Mr. McLaughlin has too much money. You ever know what people with too much money do?
We know a few.
They pay off everybody. He pays off the judge. And finally, at the end, Charlie is sitting in his office up over on Montgomery Street. And 17 years later, right? 1833. And here he is, Jacob Cox. All right? Puts the curse on dead cow curve. But he doesn't get his money. And he says, I'll even sell it for $40,000. And McLaughlin laughed at him, drew out a bowie knife, and Mr. Cox takes out his pistol and shoots McLaughlin straight in the chest 4 times in 1883, and of course he murders him. And nobody liked Mr. McLaughlin. And everybody liked everybody felt sorry for poor Mr. Cox, and there was never a trial. Cox was found not guilty at the coroner's inquest. And so this is a curse that's put here, and no trains ever made it through here to go to San Francisco because, and we'll get to it in a couple minutes here, what happens is a few other people step in, and instead of going to San Francisco like they wanted to, the trains pulled into Alameda and into Oakland, and Oakland took over, and it all is because of the curse of the dead cow.
Right. We got to speed it up. The what did the president of the Confederacy have to do with that?
Somebody, the thing of it is,
Sorry.
if you look at the maps, you'll find something called the Gadsden Purchase way in southern California, southern New Mexico, and southern Arizona. And Jefferson Davis, at the time, this is before the Civil War, he bought this land from Mexico, and he wanted to put a train going through the South. And some people say, well, Mr. Cox didn't put that curse on there, Jefferson Davis.
Yep. This largely repeats what you just said. Okay, Code Island grab.
Oh, yeah, he's trying to hurry me up. So,
It's all you.
okay, so here's what happens. The trains, instead of running into San Francisco, the trains run into Alameda and Oakland, and you can go down right now to the port of Oakland and look over at the Agroforestry Island, and you can almost touch it. And these guys, the big four, Leland Stanford in charge here, he's already, not only before this, stolen the Oakland waterfront, him and his buddies. Then he wants to steal what they then call Goat Island, which is Agroforestry Island. And there's this thing called the Goat Island grab. And the railroad wanted to steal Goat Island so they could put a bridge over there. First a little place, where they could just bring their trains over, and then a bridge, and then all of a sudden you have what you have today, with the same idea as the Bay Bridge, with just with the trains though. You're not allowed on, just with the trains. And so the federal government stepped in, and they sent the military in 1867, and the military's been there since to make sure that the railroads don't get Rhode Island. Now later on, it's a good picture, because that's as far as they ever got right there. That's the big freight wharf right there, all this here, and that's the passenger wharf right there for what, by the time this picture was taken, was the Southern Pacific Railroad. So this is what happened to Gibbons Folly right here.
Right. So we gotta get to the end of the story here, which is that our dear friend from Alameda, A. Cohen, he hooked him up. He hooked him up and saved them a ton of time. Basically, if the railroad had gone down to San Jose and then back up the peninsula to San Francisco, the ride would have taken 4 hours. Instead, you took an hour-and-a-half ride into Oakland, and then you hopped on the ferry, which was another 45 minutes or so. But still, it was a much shorter trip from Sacramento to San Francisco to actually get off the train at Alameda and then later Oakland and take the ferry. So, yep. Anything else?
So, they agreed.
Yeah.
The big four agreed, no train into San Francisco, we're really sorry, and to this day, you gotta get off the train everywhere.
Right. And we should probably point out that there's a reason why we're talking about this. Okay, because the 1869 arrival of the first train, which I guess is coming up here, it happened exactly 150 years ago this month. Congratulations. Yes, 150. And really, they were celebrating out there in May 10th, 1869 is when we celebrate the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, but it wasn't actually done. And those are the points that we need to make before time runs out.
So, the thing of it is, it's kind of tough to say we have a transcontinental train that runs from Omaha to Sacramento. It doesn't work. So they have to make this up. They got to get to San Francisco somehow, and that somehow was pulling into Alameda until they got the tracks done over in Oakland. Alameda, September 6, 1869, November 8, 1869, they finally pull into Oakland.
And why did Oakland take over from Alameda? Was it that much further west? Was it more significant? No? It was just, that's what the Big Four wanted?
It's tough to say.
Because...
You laugh, but here's the thing. All this stuff was done in secret. You know what I mean? The Oakland waterfront was stolen in secret. Cohen got his money in secret. So part of the answer is, as a history person, I hate to say this, but I don't know.
Something Dennis doesn't know. I love it. No, we'll find out someday. Anyway, this was one of the problems. This was one of the things in the way. Well, at least on the first day. On that September 6th, 1869, when we say the first train showed up in Alameda, this bridge was not done.
Right. They get on the train, Stanford and Cohen and all their buddies get on the train up in Sacramento, and they're going to come down into Alameda, and they're going to get here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they got the beer and the food and the beer big tent all ready and the Greek all ready to go, and they get to this bridge, they think everything's done. But Leland Stanford's on the train, you got to finish the bridge. Cohen's on the train, you got to finish the bridge. So they did finish the bridge, but the train didn't come to Alameda until midnight. All the beer was gone, and all the food was eaten, and all the trees were all shrunk up.
Good. All right. So, and here's a map showing you kind of, I mean, we don't have time for this at all, but, it's showing you, how the Transcontinental Railroad did it. This is the route they take nowadays, which is apparently a lot more efficient. I don't know. The pink one. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so yeah, that bridge. And then there was that other bridge on the Missouri River that wasn't done that would have connected Council Bluffs to Omaha. That wasn't done until 1872. That's 3 years later, 3 years after the Golden Spike. I made the point. All right, we made the point. Okay, and
then they are.
And here's just a nod at the ferries and the ferry captains. Charles Minturn, he's got a street name for him in Alameda.
Just like Google Sunday.
Evanosky Way and Eric Koss Avenue. Koss, yeah. Well, when he says it, he's the avenue and I'm the way. But anyway, okay. So yeah, and then just right after that, we have the first train accident in California. Just like a couple of months after it arrives.
They got this drunken guy who can't read at the switch. And here comes this train on the way to Omaha. Here goes that train on the way to Alameda. And the drunken guy at the switch who can't read tells the Central Pacific guy, okay, go ahead. And there's another train on the track. And everybody's day is ruined. And here's the funniest part of all. This is how we got to end this thing, is that the closest hospital, and you cannot make this up, the closest hospital was an insane asylum in Alameda. And if you don't believe me, there it is right there. The Alameda Park Asylum. The illiterate train washer at the switch, the closest hospital, the Alameda Park Asylum for the insane.
Right. So, if you were fascinated by these stories and you'd like to see them retold in like video form, we're trying to raise funds for a documentary. You can also support us by buying a book. I'm sorry, I cut you off. That was it. Oh yeah, we gotta go. But yeah, go to GoFundMe, maybe search for the Myth of the Golden Spike and send us a few bucks. We'd love it. Thank you.
One question. That was good. Oh, I'm sorry. What was the Dunbarton? What was the Dunbarton Trail? That was at first it was where they were going out the main station for the different railroad in 1878, and then later on they just laid the bridge across there. But the railroad connection to that is the South Pacific Coast Railroad, which was built in 1878. After this was all done. A whole different railroad. Maybe we can come back another time and talk about that.
Here for Dennis and Eric.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break, grab another beer, and we'll be back with our next talk.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and other distinguished members of the scientific community. Thank you for your time. My name is Shayaporn Tiragunsatit. Do not attempt to pronounce it. It is a Thai name, and every time someone mispronounces a Thai name, a waiter lies to a customer about how spicy medium is. It is my honor to be here on the 5th anniversary of the attacks in San Francisco, Las Vegas, Honolulu, and Genjiro, Japan. I remember where I was when I watched a 2-hour, 3-minute special news report. The devastation was truly shocking, as was the lack of character development and pacing. But it should only serve to highlight the importance of today's topic of discussion, and I hope that the information I provide here can help in some way. Since the 1950s, an ominous threat has loomed over the people of Earth, but I believe by developing a deeper understanding of the facts, we can help to diminish, or perhaps avoid altogether, the catastrophic impact of this deadly menace. And so, to that end, this is Godzilla, History, Biology, and Behavior of Hyper-Evolved Theropod Kaiju. The first encounter with Godzilla occurred in 1954 on Oto Island, a southern Japanese fishing village. It was at this time that the first serious work on the creature was done by Professor Kyohei Yamane, who theorized that the creature was a dinosaur of the Cretaceous era, which had survived in undersea caves until disturbed and mutated by nuclear weapons tests in the nearby Bikini Islands. He named it Gojira after a local Oto Island folk legend of a sea monster, and the name was eventually anglicized to Godzilla because that's clearly what the Asian people were trying to say in the first place. The creature eventually reached Tokyo, as you can see in these aerial photos. It's right there. Drawn there, perhaps, by the hordes of Japanese people running around screaming his name. Fortunately, Godzilla was eventually destroyed in Tokyo Bay with the prototype of an experimental weapon, the Oxygen Destroyer, invented by scientist and part-time Bond villain Daisuke Serizawa, who later destroyed the device, its designs, and himself in the process in order to prevent the weapon from ever being misused. Now, in the years since this initial attack, there have been over 23 encounters with at least 6 different Godzilla-class creatures, as well as numerous other Godzilla-class kaiju. Prior to 2014's attacks, there had not been a Godzilla sighting since the attempted alien invasion in 2004, which I'm sure you all recall. Now, some basic characteristics of Godzilla. A fully grown Godzilla can range in height from 50 to 110 meters tall, with the species exhibiting a steady increase in height over the past 6 decades, with a few deviations in the 1990s. It is, of course, difficult to measure Godzilla's exact height, as it tends to slouch. We can approximate its weight using a simple water displacement and scaling calculation at anywhere from 20,000 to 160,000 tons. Now, Godzilla can also achieve a land speed of at least 122 miles per hour. Their nautical speed is thought to be equal to or even greater than this velocity, given the speed at which Godzilla is able to move between various land masses. Now, while for many years, and for obvious reasons, it has been extremely difficult to directly study the anatomy of Godzilla, we can morphologically infer certain details. Based on Professor Yamane's findings, we know that Godzilla is a dinosaur. We can extrapolate the skeletal structure of the creature by analyzing footage from the 1954 Ishiro Honda documentary, and from this, we can safely say that it is a carnivore, as it has large pointed teeth and forward-facing eyes which allow the stereoscopic vision necessary to catch prey. More specifically, its bipedal nature, large deep head, short neck, and body clearly illustrate that it is a form of theropod, a group which includes Tyrannosaurus and Allosaurus, and a primitive theropod at that, as it has unusually long arms for a large theropod and 4 fingers and toes. For reasons nobody yet understands, throughout their development, theropods experienced a reduction in the number of digits and arm length as well. You see 4, 3, 2. Exactly which dinosaur Godzilla mutated from was the topic of some debate. There are some who believed it was perhaps the Abeliasaur carnotaurus, and others who speculated that it was Ceratosaurus due to the row of armor plates along its back. However, in the end, Professor Yamane was correct when he postulated that Godzilla was derived from a transitional form, as was confirmed in 1991 upon the discovery of the preliminarily named Godzillasaurus, a specimen of which survived on Lagos Island and shortly thereafter was mutated into a fully grown Godzilla itself. Now, the initial nuclear weapons tests which created Godzilla occurred between 1946 and 1958. So how did these surviving theropods change so rapidly and drastically? Well, the answer lies in the phenomenon of hyperevolution. Hyperevolution is a process of rapid genetic mutation where an individual's body in a manner paralleling millions of years of natural evolution within a short span of time. Rapid physical changes can occur nearly instantaneously using a technique called molecular sliding, an ability also found in the sea cucumber. As a result, Godzilla can evolve not only from generation to generation, but within their own lifetime as well, gaining speed, strength, size, and even developing more advanced cognitive skills. Here we can see other recent examples of hyperevolution. The last of which shares a striking number of characteristics with Godzilla. The key similarity, aside from the increased bone, skin, tissue density, and strength, is the massive regenerative abilities that both these creatures have developed. It not only helps keep Godzilla from collapsing into a giant puddle of its own flesh, it also augments its already incredibly strong hide, creating a state of near invulnerability. Now, the secret of these abilities lies in a mysterious substance in Godzilla's cells called Regenerator G1. I believe... Should I switch? Here we go. Sure. One moment, please.